We've been in the middle of this series, well actually we've been in a series called Twisted Lemons, and this is all about making lemonade out of the lemons that life gives us. And so if you're new here today, if this is your first day, you're kind of coming in at the tail end of the movie, as it were, because we've been in the book of Peter for 5 weeks. This is the 5th week that we've been in the book of Peter, and so we've learned a lot about 1 Peter and how it applies to our lives and so forth through this series, Twisted Lemon. Today, the sermon, and it's the last in the series, is called The Lemonade Stand. The lemonade stand. So many people have encountered a lemonade stand in their time, and drop by and you're going to throw a quarter in there. I mean, kids are getting pretty demanding these days. I read on Facebook this one person was driving by a lemonade stand and, basically didn't have change for a 20 or whatever, and they were just like expecting the person to throw down the 20, and so the guy actually did. He was feeling like really generous and whatever, gave the 20, and then he got like this Dixie cup full of lukewarm, watered down lemonade. He said, these kids really know how to do it, these days. So as we start though, I'm wondering, and I looked this up because I was wondering where these guys are getting prepared for something in just a second. So just focus on me just for a second, and then we'll move into the lemonade stand, because we're going to have a lemonade stand in church. Isn't that cool? So here's the thing. We've all heard the phrase, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Right? How many people have heard that? How many people know where the phrase comes from? Put up your hand if you know. Usually Josh Johnson is here, and he goes, oh yeah, I know where that comes from. But he's not here today. So I'm going to tell you where the phrase comes from. The phrase was initially coined by a Christian writer. His name was Elbert Hubbard in 1915. So we're literally celebrating the 100th anniversary of this phrase. Okay, so get this. Elbert Hubbard wrote an obituary. He wrote an obituary, and in the obituary he was writing it for a friend of his. This was actually, get this, 1915. Think of how early movies were at this time, right? Movies were just kind of coming on the scene. And so he was writing the obituary of a friend of his who was a midget, who was a dwarf or a little person. And so he's writing this obituary, and in his obituary, he says these words. He said of his friend, this midget person, who was Marshall Wilder, he said he was a walking, get this, he was a walking refutation of that dogmatic statement that is, and I won't pronounce it, but it's basically in Latin, and I'll just give you the English version, he was a walking refutation of that dogmatic statement, a healthy mind in a healthy body. So then he continues on, he says, his was a sound mind in an unsound body, and he proved the eternal paradox of things. He cashed in on his disabilities. He cashed in on his disabilities. He picked up the lemons that fate had sent him and started a lemonade stand. So picture this guy, right? All of the odds were stacked against him. His body didn't work too well. He was obviously marginalized because he was a midget, and I know that's not a politically correct term, but I'm using that term because they literally use the term dwarf. I'm thinking, oh wow, this is kind of crazy. So now we call them little people, and so I get all that, but you know how marginalized this guy would have been. Some people have little man syndrome, or some people have, all of these issues they have to fight through in the course of their life, and he was no different. And then so you got this friend of his who's watching him courageously go through life. Courageously go through life. Hello, friends. Good to see you. They tried to sneak in, but I saw them. These are really great friends of ours from the Barrie area. Nice shade of red, Brian. Awesome. Glad that you guys are with us. You came in just in time for lemonade, and there's ice cream. There's ice cream after, so you know what I mean? It's a good day in church. However, so he was observing his friend going through all of these things, and he said, you know what, that guy's got so much courage. That guy's got so much chutzpah in the face of all of these disabilities, in the face of all of this stuff coming against him, all of the lemons that life gave him, he could stand up and he could make a lemonade stand. And that's what we're talking about today. So if I can, just mess with the operations today, I got all these lemons in this basket, and these are props, as Natasha so aptly pointed out. So here's the thing. We've said this before, and we all know this. I mean, let's face it, we all know this. That even though we're not necessarily a midget, right? We're not, I don't see any midgets. I've been called a midget before, but usually by my older brother. We all have things in our lives that we would consider lemons, right? Things that come our way that are sour to the taste in the middle of our lives. Let's face it, right? We get the doctor's report, and the doctor's report just is not good. And so as you're thinking about it and mulling over what the ramifications of that doctor's report are, you're thinking, man, that's a bitter pill to swallow. I didn't want it to work out like this. There are relational lemons. This person that you guys have been tracking with your entire lives, and things have been great, and all of a sudden something happens, something comes your way, and all of a sudden now it's like, man, life just handed me a whole basket full of lemons. What am I supposed to do with this? With this relationship that went sour? It's getting real. They're starting to spill. And you know what? I think of churches at times. And when we look at 1 Peter 5, 1 Peter 5 specifically talks about the life of a church. The longer Peter writes in the course, obviously he's writing to the church, the more specific he gets to the church. And how many people, you don't have to raise your hand, but how many people have been on the receiving end of a sour church experience? And maybe you've been, in a church and you've been in the middle of that sour experience. Or maybe it's just been a church person that has brought you a sour experience and has left a sour taste in your mouth. And so the idea here is that we need to, when life gives us lemons, we need to make lemonade. The struggle is real. So having said all of that, Tori, I'm going to need you. Having said all of that, I want to dive into the actual text of our sermon today. And for those of you who have been tracking with us over the last number of weeks, you've heard a lot of the context, and you've probably learned a lot about the context of 1 Peter. And so here's what I did. I thought, well, I don't want to not do the context because I think that's so important. I think it's so important in this book. Did you spill on the iPad? Oh, okay. Okay. She's over there mopping up. So I want to do the context of 1 Peter in 50 words or less. Okay, you ready for this? So Tori, you're going to lead us through on this. So if you're trying to figure out what 1 Peter is all about before we dive into chapter 5, this is kind of the overarching theme of what's happening in 1 Peter, why he's writing the book and who he is and all this kind of stuff. So here's the first thing you need to know is that it's a circular letter to Christians in modern Turkey, in what is now modern-day Turkey, which is just north of Syria, where all the trouble is. Seems like there's been trouble in that region for a while. Second thing is this. It's 64 AD. Most scholars believe it's somewhere between 62, 64. Most of them believe it's in 64 AD. Peter's life is near the end, and so if you can understand this, these are his last words. So he's pushing into this, going, I better write this down. I need to get through to these people so that they understand, have some marching orders. And then the third thing is that in the government of the time was almost the most, you think our government's bad? The most heinous government of all time. And Nero, who was the emperor in Rome at the time, he burnt Rome to the ground and then blamed the Christians for it. And so, nice guy, really nice guy, but this is what the Christians were going through. So what happened was there was widespread first century persecution, and we've heard all the stories about this, but this is what they were going through. And so as Peter's writing to the church, this is exactly what he was writing them to. And then, of course, we come across the two S words, and I know we're not allowed to use the S words in church. Nobody likes the S word. Nobody likes to use the S word. Nobody likes to hear the S word. Submission, suffering. Ugh, we hate those words. But if you notice, 21 times suffering is mentioned, submission is mentioned in almost every chapter, and so the S words come up time and time again. And guess what? You're in for a treat today, because chapter 5, he doesn't disappoint. He brings up these two themes again. There's a third theme that always comes up. I think he mentions it 4 different times, and it's this whole idea of focusing on the temporal, the here and now, and then the eternal. And remember the first week we brought out that 50-foot rope, and we have this little bit of the rope that we focus on. We get all, everything in a knot, and we're like, oh, how about our RSP, and, how about our health, and all this kind of stuff. But then there's this eternal life that we're going to have in God. And so he says, keep focusing on the temporal, don't focus on the temporal, focus on the eternal. And then the idea of this book is kind of like the book of James, if you've read the book of James. This book is practical, practical, practical. And so if you want marching orders, if you want how to, as much as a lot of the context of this book we don't really relate to because we don't really know what it's like to be in the suffering that they were under. A lot of what Peter says in this book is multi-generational. And it can speak to us today just as much as it spoke to them in their context. What it said to them in their context, even though our context is different, it can still speak the same things to us today. So I won't do a recap, but I want to dive right into the text. And so the text will be on the screen for you. And I'm going to read it from my Bible here. And we're going to go through the first, I think it's 7 verses. And we'll see what God has to say to us through His Word. And so, again, like we did with the book of James in March, we're reading every word of the entire book. So believe that all of God's counsel is good for us to hear, right? So here we go. And now a word to you. So this is actually, I will read it off here because I think I got a different translation. Okay. To the elders among you I appeal as a fellow elder. So remember, this is Peter talking. As a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in the glory to be revealed. Again, that eternal theme. He says, be shepherds of the flock. So understand something. I mean, if you're not a Christian here today, you can listen to this. It really doesn't apply to you because Peter's specifically talking to, and as we've tracked through the book of Peter, he's talked to us about the government. He's talked to us about church, church involvement and all that kind of stuff, and community involvement. He's talked about husbands and wives. He's talked about our environment in work. And so then he's talked about the church, and then now he's dropped down to talking to the leaders. And he's saying, okay, so I'm a leader, you're a leader, and so he says, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you're willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain. So apparently there was some of that going on in this day and age, but be eager to serve. Not lording it over, right? Some people get on a power trip. Not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd comes, I love that statement. This is all about Jesus. When the chief shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of glory that will never fade away. Again, temporal versus eternal. Right? Temporal versus eternal. And we have to focus on the eternal. In the same way, and now he kind of switches gears, talks to another segment of the church. In the same way, you who are younger, if you consider yourself younger, then take note to this. Submit yourselves. There's that S word again. Submit yourselves to your elders. Ugh, we don't like that, do we? Taylor, this one's for you, bud. Thank you. Okay, so submit yourselves to your elders. And then he encompasses everybody. So if you're in the church, because they would all have gathered around and read this letter together. So now all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another because. And we're going to apply this right at the end. I really believe, and I hope we can apply this forever and ever. Amen. Because God opposes the proud. You want to get on God's bad side? Just think you're all that. Just think you got it going on. Just think you don't need God. God opposes that kind of attitude. God opposes the proud but shows favor to the humble. So then he says, the application here is obvious. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. So Peter even gets to the point where he goes like, you know what, if you're humbling yourself before somebody, there's obviously situations at work or situations in a marriage or situations, in your health or whatever, and they cause great anxiety. And so he's like, no, just humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. Don't worry about the mighty hand of Rome or the mighty hand of your boss or the mighty hand of this or your mighty hand of... humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. Right? Humble yourself. And even in so doing, if you have all this anxiety, cast your anxiety on God because God cares for you. God cares for you. So there's a number of different terms here that I could totally go into, but in the interest of time, I'm thinking, you know what? I think the message, even in just reading it, is so clear. As it pertains to leaders, we need to be humble and be submissive and not lord it over and not think of ourselves more highly than we ought, even as Romans says. And I think it bears out with this story of Ronald Reagan. Many of you would know Ronald Reagan, and some of you who would not know Ronald Reagan. He was, I think, the last president who it was attempted. He was attempted to be assassinated, and so it was 1980, I believe. I think if I get my dates right, and he was shot. I think he was shot twice. And so the idea is, and the story is told, that he's in his hospital room, and the nurse walks in on him. He's the president of the most powerful nation in the world, and he's on his hands and knees, and he's wiping up some water that had spilled that was in the bathroom. And so she's like, oh my goodness, you're the president. Like, stop doing that. We have people for this. And he said, you know what, I just didn't want anybody to get in trouble, right, for there being water all over the bathroom. Right? Pretty humble guy, right? And so I heard it said about this story that a lot of people have met a standing president, but not too many people have ever met a kneeling president. And as it pertains to leadership, you know, we all have to understand that even Jesus is a greater example still of how even in leadership we need to be able to be servant and have servant leadership elements to what we do. So, however, there's this whole idea of the S word, and nobody likes the S word. And as we've said, you know what? Submit to the government. You know, submit to your boss. If you're at work, you got to submit to your boss. You know, we also talked about wives submitting to your husbands, and we kind of wrestled all that through. And then we even said that husbands, there's this element of mutual submission. If a marriage is going to work, there's this element of mutual submission. In church life, we talked about that as well in chapter 3. And then he's talking here about submission. So I want to actually bring back, because I think this is so key for all of us. And so key. So let's go through this, because here's what we think of when we think of submission. And we already said this, and we know this, right? When you think of submission, it's like, okay, the dog is going to do what I say. And so I'm either going to incent the dog with a treat, or I'm going to beat the dog over the head, but the dog will submit. The dog will do. I am Lord over the dog, right? So we think submit. We think, well, what do you think? Are you going to beat me? You know, are you going to, right? And so there's this idea, and here's another picture we have of submit, right? Where it's like, I am going to wrestle you, and I'm going to hold you, and either you're going to faint or you're going to tap out, but you will submit, right? You will submit. Here's another one we think of submit. It's like, what do you want? You want me to be a doormat now? Like, is that where this is going, right? The S word. Nobody likes the S word. And so here's what what I want to do is just bring this out a little bit further. And this is a bit of review, if you remember week 3. The idea of humility is this, and submission is this word hypostasos. It's a Greek word, and it's a military term. So it means rank. It means rank in military. And so I know some of you have had service, and you understand that there's a certain pecking order, and the reason for the pecking order is so that when war breaks out, somebody knows where to go for answers. Somebody knows where to go for direction. Right? There's an order. It's not chaotic. It's not like everybody just does whatever they want to do. Okay, well, I'm going to go take that hill. Okay, well, good for you. We'll all stay back here and watch you die. You know, it's like, no, the sergeant said this is what we all have to do together. And so here's more a picture of what Peter is talking about when he's talking about submission and humility. He's like, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. And some of us don't get the whole military theme because we've never been in the military. But this is a picture, and I thought of you, Brian, when I was doing this. So get this next picture. This is a picture of submission. Okay? This is a picture of submission. Why? Because every player on that field has a job to do. And then the coach has said, okay, you're going to go here, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do this. And so every player, if they execute that play well, and if they all do their job, and they all submit to the boss's orders or the coach's orders, and they all do what should be done, hey, then you know what? They might actually accomplish what they're trying to accomplish on that specific play. But you know, if the coach comes out and says, okay, we got a play here, and you know, Grant, you're going to go this way, and Prosh, you're going to go that way, and whatever, and then Grant goes, I'm not doing that. Forget it. I'm just going to stand here. I think that's a stupid idea. Well, then the play is going to just break down because he will not submit, he will not obey. And so that is a better picture of what Peter's trying to talk about when he's talking about submission. So there's a great, you can put this picture up here. Some of you who are older football fans, if you're a football fan, you would know this picture here, Roger Staubach. Super Bowl winning quarterback, just an amazing player, a legend if you're in the Dallas area. Obviously, Dallas Cowboys, World Championship 71 and others. But he had a coach, and the coach was also no slouch either, Coach Tom Landry. And so here's a direct quote, because there was some tension in the early stages of the relationship between Tom Landry, the coach, and Roger Staubach, the quarterback. There was tension. There was relational lemons that were being brought to the table. And so listen how Roger Staubach actually decided, hey, I'm going to make a lemonade out of this situation. I'm going to make lemonade. He says, and I got to find the quote. He says, I faced up to the issue. So a little bit more context. So in today's football, a lot of times they'll wear earpieces, and the coach will call in a play, but the quarterback can basically do whatever he wants. So the quarterback will call the play, on and on. In this scenario, it was that Tom Landry called every single play. No ifs, ands, buts about it. And so Roger Staubach, you have to obey, you have to trust, you have to do it, you have to submit to me in this way. And Roger, again, had his nose out of joint about this. He thought, well, I shouldn't have to do that. I'm a Super Bowl winning quarterback. Like, I don't have to listen to you. But then he said, I faced up to the issue of obedience. And once I learned to obey, there was harmony, there was fulfillment, and there was victory. There was victory. And the principle is as clear as the noses on all of our faces. Pride kills. Pride will kill an organization. Pride will kill a dream. Pride will kill a marriage. Pride will kill a church. Pride will kill an organization. Pride will kill, people who are ascending to office and get too proud. Pride will kill. And so we're learning, and I hope you're picking up here, that humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's just thinking about yourself less. Right? The difference. C.S. Lewis has this amazing quote. It says this, a proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you cannot see anything that's above you. And I think, this is a wake-up call to some of us who think we have all the answers, who think we actually know what's going on. And sometimes we'll approach a situation and you're like, it's my way or the highway. In your marriage, you'll say, you know what, I don't care. I'm going to do it my way, and you're wrong. Or in your work environment, it's the exact same way. And you just you won't budge. And you're arrogant and you're prideful. And there's tension. Sometimes this happens between fathers and sons, or mothers and daughters, or, in the family dynamic. And many of you have experienced separation. You've experienced lemons when pride has reared its ugly head from one side or the other. So we know that pride kills. And we understand that Peter is saying here that we need to put on humility. It's interesting that when he says, and he says it a little bit later on, he says, clothe yourself in humility. And the word clothe is only, this word, clothe, is only used once in the entire Bible. And the idea of it is that it was the word for the knot that was tied to the apron of a slave. And the idea is, and again, it depends on who you listen to or what scholars you read, but the idea is that for us, if we put on our own apron, we usually just tie a bow knot, right? That's pretty easy. But the idea with this is, once the apron was tied on, you had to let somebody else take the apron off. Now that's humility, right? That's servant-heartedness. And that's what Peter is talking about today. Let's move on. So here's Peter goes on in verse 8, and he says, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered for a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. To him be the power forever and ever. Amen. And then he has a couple of little closing remarks at the end here. So the final greetings are, with the help of Silas, whom I regard as a faithful brother, I have written to you briefly, encouraging you and testifying that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. That's where we get the whole lemonade stand. Stand fast in it. She who is in Babylon, meaning the rulers and all of this kind of stuff, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark. Greet one another with a kiss of love. Peace to all of you who are in Christ. So, I don't know about any of you out there that are Bible scholars, but there is this whole idea of God opposes the proud but shows grace to the humble. Tori, just put up James 4:6. So check it out. This is incredible. Like, this stuff is incredible to me, and I hope you can just take a little glimpse. I'm going to make an application to this in a second. This is just an observation first. That almost verbatim what Peter has said, James said about 10 years earlier, because James wrote basically the first book in the New Testament. And so just catch the vernacular. Just catch the way James is phrasing this. He says literally quotes the exact same proverb. He says God opposes the proud. We've heard that before with Peter, but shows favor to the humble. Exact quote. And then he says, submit yourselves. All of a sudden, James is pulling out the S word. Right? Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come near to God and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, wail. Change your laughter into mourning and your joy to gloom. And then he says, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. Like, I don't know about you, I just put them side by side and read them basically together, and I'm like, it looks like these guys are reading from the same script. Either the problems were the same in the church, or these guys were comparing notes, but these letters were written about 10 years later. Here's what I'm thinking, and this is going to be my application, is that I believe there was a culture in the church at that time. Obviously, we know that suffering was prevalent. We know that there was widespread persecution, and it got even greater as Peter was writing to the people that he was writing to. But the idea here is that there's a specific culture that existed, and there's also a specific culture that James and Peter, as leaders in the church, were trying to angle people towards. And can I just say this bluntly? Can I just say this bluntly in the interest of time? Because we've got to get to that ice cream. Culturally, our church is at a place where there is probably as much pride in the church now as there was back then. Now, there's such diversity in worship styles. There's a lot of diversity in leadership. There's a lot of diversity in methodology. There's all of this stuff. I don't think the church has ever seen this kind of diversity. But what's happened is, I believe over the last little while, is that people that sit in the seats where you're sitting and people that stand where I'm standing have all of these preconceived opinions on how it should be done and the way to victory, and what should happen and what shouldn't happen, and all of a sudden what happens is we start to get lemons. Right? So correct me if I'm wrong, but I talk to a lot of friends who are pastors. I talk to a lot of friends who are pastors. And I don't want to come off sounding negative. I don't want to add lemons to the mix. Hopefully this is a practical and positive takeaway. And the takeaway would be that we just all find this element of mutual submission, where we can all walk in lockstep and find our way to victory like that football play would be, and where we all just do our job, and we all just operate the way God intended us to operate. We all operate in the gifts that God has given us, and we do what God has called us to do. But unfortunately, I could give you probably 5 different examples of pastors that I've talked to in the last few weeks anyways, 2 or 3 weeks, where there are church situations and the church will not get to the next step for the simple reason is because there's so much pride in the leadership. And everybody wants it done their way, and everybody has their opinion, and if their opinion isn't taken to heart and followed through on, then they're going to take their ball and go home. Right? And there's a culture in our church today, and I might be overstepping it. I may be overstating it a little bit, but there's a culture that we have to guard against. Too many times we look at the person in the pew beside us and we consider them the enemy. When Peter's like, stay alert. They're not the enemy. The devil is the enemy. And he is prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Do you know the way lions attack a herd? Is they separate. Right? They'll take the weakest one off. They'll just run into. One of the reasons why lions roar is so the herd will scatter. And then they find that weakest sheep, or weakest, I don't know, ibex or whatever animal it is, and then they take that animal down. And so Peter is given a warning here. So to flip it and to make it positive, here's my thought. Here's my thought. Can you imagine the day? Could you imagine the day where we lived out this whole element of mutual submission to the place where it was a testimony in the community? You know what I'm saying? Or it's like when people thought of Highway Church, they were like, oh my goodness, those people will die for each other. Those people love each other so much. They're just so invested in what the other person is doing that they're there to help at any turn. There is such a strength of community. There is such a... Could you just imagine that? I know it's a far-fetched idea. I know I'm talking rainbows and unicorns here, right? But could you imagine if we could ever get to the place where there was this incredible lockstep movement in a church body, where we were mutually submitted to one another? Here's the deal. You don't have to agree with everything. Right? You don't have to agree with anything, with everything. Without kind of letting too much down, I've noticed there are times well, you're married. If you're married, you know you fight. So there are times when my wife and I will fight. You know what's... I got your attention now. And 5 people just woke up, including my wife. The idea is this. If I stand on my side pridefully and just go, no, she's got to come to me. I'm right, she's wrong, I know it, it's obvious, right? Like, the minute she wakes up and figures this out, we can move on with our marriage. If you're married, you know it doesn't work like that, right? If your marriage is good, you know it doesn't work like that. Because what needs to happen is there needs to be the removal of all pride on both sides, doesn't there? And there needs to be this mutual submission where it's like, you know what? Yeah, I own this. I own this. I did this and it was dumb. And I'm sorry. And guess what? I'm going to lay aside my pride. I'm going to wear the egg on my face because I'm invested in what this marriage looks like. And I know every time that we've done that, we have moved another step closer to a successful marriage. But you all know that if you stand there on your side and you get entrenched and you're just like, hey, you know it's not going to happen. I'm not going to see it your way and I'm not going to do what you want me to do and all this kind of stuff. Well, hey, then, you know, there is ongoing issues in marriage. I believe there's 3 stances that we can take. When life gives us lemons, there's 3 stances that we can take. Maybe 2, and the 3rd one comes at the end. Number 1 is this. This is what the world would tell us. Stand proud. Just stand proud. It's up to you. Just take it. Just take it, man. You don't have to put up with that. You don't have to put up with your boss's saying. You don't have to put up with that at church. That leadership or that this or that. They're telling you to do this. You don't have to put up with that. Stand proud, man. Like it's all you. Dig in your heels. Fight for your rights. That whole idea. It's the stand of arrogance. It literally is a fist to God and a fist to everybody else because, you know, God says he opposes the proud. But it's that prideful stance. And boy, oh boy, we can get there so easily, can't we? Myself included. We can get there so easily. That's stance number 1. The second stance is this. It's the lemonade stand. It's the lemonade stand. Tori, can you put up the last verses 9 and 12? It's the lemonade stand. When life gives us lemons, when there's a sour experience that comes our way. This is it. Okay, so yeah, verse 9. So it says, resist him. This is about the devil. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of thing. So there's this mutual connection. So we got to stand firm in the faith. And then go to verse 12. And he talks about this with the help of Silas, whom I regard as a faithful brother, written to you briefly, encouraging you and testifying that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. So there is this element. Paul said, we will do all, and having done all, to stand. Right? And I think it's that posture of standing proud that leaves us just absolutely obliterated. But when we have the lemonade stand, which is literally a stance where we're, the old phrase that says you stand the tallest when you're on your knees. That stance of humility, that stance that says, you know what, I'm not going to be prideful in this, will lead us to victory. The third stance is that stance. It's the victory stance. It's the victory stance. Vince Lombardi, who is probably one of the greatest, highest touted coaches of all time. You want to talk about a coach who had his team running in mutual submission and in lockstep. Vince Lombardi. He said this: I firmly believe that any man's finest hour, his greatest fulfillment to all he holds dear, is that moment when he has worked his heart out in a good cause and lies exhausted on the field of battle, victorious. The stand of victory. And I pray that as a church, we will find that place where we are mutually submissive to one another, and where we can find our place and work our way towards victory. Would you pray with me?